In this video, I'm going to introduce you to a handful of lesser known elemental creatures in Dungeons & Dragons that you can use in your next campaign or one-shot session. Let's roll that intro. Hello everyone and welcome back to the TheDMSide. Now, in this week's video, we are continuing our journey through the monster manual where I have hand selected a couple of monsters that I believe aren't really getting the attention that they fully deserve from each monster type. And this week we are looking at the elemental creatures. Now, as always, like the video, it does help the channel and I really appreciate it. Subscribe if you would like to keep up to date with our future videos. And as always, comment down below at the end of the video your favorite elemental. The very first creature we have on our list today is for the fans of the Studio Ghibli movie Princess Mononoke. It is known as the Chawinga. It is a small, tiny elemental creature that is primarily found where there is an abundance of nature. So generally in your fantasy-driven Dungeons & Dragons world, there is a chance that you have quite a deep, mysterious forest or a hot, long expanse of a desert or even high-peaked mountaintops. These creatures can be found in all of those areas. Now, they aren't really easy to find because they can literally live within the earth itself. But should your players find them and become friends with them, these creatures can actually grant very minor gifts to your players to help aid them along their journeys. Now, they are definitely not for battle, I would say. They have a challenge rating of 0. They're really just these cute little elemental creatures that are really fun to plot around and have your players interact with should they get the chance. Now, players, if you have a very nice DM and you have a conversation with them, there's a chance you can actually summon these creatures to help your players, your party, at a certain point in the game. Because if you have the Conjure Elemental spell, then you technically can summon these creatures because the spell says you would have to summon a elemental creature from challenge rating 5 or lower. Now, the only problem is the list that you get on D&D Beyond doesn't give you challenge rating 0 as your bottom. It actually gives you challenge rating 1 as your bottom. So you need to have a conversation with your DM as to whether these creatures, whether their minor gifts would break the party essentially or break the actual game. Personally, I actually don't think it would. They're really just very tiny buffs, generally giving you maybe a slight resistance for a short amount of time to a certain type of damage. But at the same time, that could become an issue when you are about to go into a battle and then you summon these creatures. So it's a conversation you should have with your DM. But they are really fantastic creatures, DMs, to play and have in your world just to make it feel a bit more lively and a little bit more spiritually inclined, I guess you could say. The next creature we have on our list calls the elemental plane of fire its home, and it's not the Ifrit, the fire genies. It is a lesser known creature known as the Azza or Aza. Now the Azza, they resemble a dwarf, and so when on the material plane, your players may actually see them in a distance holding a torch, moving closer to them. But as they get closer, the big key differences start to come into focus. They have no beard and their bodies are completely engulfed in flame. They have resistance to fire damage and poison damage, and on top of that, should your players decide to fight and attack them, every time they make physical contact with the creature, they will take fire damage as a penalty for actually touching them. On top of that, the Aza can pick up any weapon and that weapon then deals extra fire damage during battle. Now, why are these creatures so sought after, however? Why are they so good? One of the main reasons is that they craft magical items like no others. They can create magical swords, shields, armors, and they can even aid in creating very particular items, usually just the encasing of them. And so they're usually sought after and forced in most cases. Unfortunately, the Azza's history does have quite a lot of enslavement, for they are actually foes to the Ifrit on the fire plane where they have been enslaved for many, many years. So DMs, in your story, you could actually use these creatures to aid your players should they agree maybe to help release them from their imprisonment from Nefrit. Or, on the flip side, if you would like to have them be a foe, they are well known to be great guards for fire giant strongholds. So if you're running something like Storm King's Thunder, you could have your Azers be the guards of the fire giant hold. Or if you're running your own giant campaign, then these are really interesting creatures. So throw them into your next giant campaign, or have your players travel to the elemental plane of fire to deal with them. The next creature on our list is a very classic creature, and so if you haven't used it, I'm here to encourage you because I love them and I think they're really amazing, fantastic elemental creatures to put in any campaign, and they are known as the Gargoyles. Gargoyles lurk in the shadows, they hide as statues throughout the day, stalking their prey, strong enough to lift them and fly them away, and then drop them from great heights, just so that way they can kill them. They are cruel creatures that delight in their murderous ways, and they are from the Earth Elemental Plane originally. These creatures are amazing to put in your campaign, whether it be a dark gothic one such as Curse of Strahd, an Underdark campaign such as the Out of the Abyss, or if you're running Rise of Tiamat, it'll really throw your players should you put them randomly in the game where they think they're going to run into dragon cultists or dragons in general. Have a stone statue come to life. If you're running a higher level campaign, there are different gargoyles that you can include. There's one that is, I do believe it has 4 arms. The 4-armed gargoyle has a lot more health, and it has a few more abilities, so I would consider looking at that if you're running high level. When you're running your low levels, just be aware that because these things are solid stone, they actually take half damage to any physical attacks unless it is magical or it is using your player is using an adamantine weapon. So be aware of that for DMs, as it'll just take longer for your players to put it down. Generally, they should be okay when you're around the 3rd level anyway. If you go lower than that, I would just play it a little bit careful. Maybe have your players retreat and let them know that that's an option. But the Gargoyle is very classic. It definitely needs to be in your next campaign. So throw it in and let me know how it went. The next creature we have is definitely one that I personally have not seen in battle or in any part of the story yet, and so I wonder if it actually isn't being used at all. So my big question to start us off with is, do your players want 5,000 gold? Because if they do, they should just go and hunt what is known as a flail snail. This fire elemental creature is a large snail-like creature which has, I believe it's 10 tentacles for eyes, and on top of that, the snail shell itself is known to be worth thousands of gold. Now, obviously, you can play it where your players might get shortchanged or they may bargain for more, but the main reason is that these snail shells hold great magical abilities. They actually have a form of an anti-magic spell cast upon them, so they get advantage against saving throws for spells, but on top of that, should your players be able to harvest it, they may be able to keep the magical ability within the shield once it has been crafted, which would then in turn give them that same benefit. Now, getting the shell is very difficult because first you have to kill the creature, and when battling the creature, it gets as many attacks as it has tentacles. So essentially it starts off with like 10 attacks. On top of that, the creature is making saves. It has a really high AC because of the shell. So your players have to really work hard to beat down this large snail. Once they have done that, and they've gotten rid of all the tentacles, basically what happens is the snail retreats into its shell and then it wails loudly for like 5d6 hours, so maximum 6 hours of just screeching and screeching. The only way to stop it is either to kill the creature by breaking through the shell, which becomes harder because once it actually goes into the shell, the armor class of the shell goes up by +4, and so it's just wailing and wailing, which would call upon other creatures, evil creatures, just creatures in general, beasts, monstrosities. You could have giants come in, dragons flying from the sky, a manticore. You could have other adventures coming in who are looking to harvest this creature themselves. And so you actually aren't worried about making an interesting battle with the snail. You're actually more interested as a DM making what comes when the snail wails. The other option is that your players can actually just wait out the screaming. However, obviously that would attract more things to show up. The problem with killing the snail when it's inside the shell is that that could possibly ruin and break and damage exactly what they came to get, because they would need to crack through it to kill the creature. So it's a really good dynamic of how your players are going to deal with this. Do they wait out the time and battle everything that comes its way? Or are they going to try and pry it from the shell and break the shell and hope that they don't ruin the magical abilities? They're really interesting creatures. I've still yet to see them be used, but if you would like a really high paying quest for your players, even at higher level, because you can make it that they just can't break through the shell, and so they have to take on these waves, these hordes of enemies that are coming to retrieve it themselves. So that's how you could do it for your high level players. For your low level players, you could give them the ability to actually break the shell, and then you as a DM, you decide, well, how intact is it? How much of the magic actually has stayed within the shell? And then you see how it goes once it's been crafted into an item from there. But these creatures are awesome. I really want to see someone use them. If you have used them, comment down below and tell me exactly what it was, how the players dealt with it, because I got to get some ideas for this thing. Moving away from the fire elemental creature, let's go more of an earthy feel, I think. This creature that I'm about to introduce to you is known as the Zorn. Now, a Zorn isn't necessarily an evil creature. It's actually more just like a beast, I guess you could say. It just gets angry at those that are getting in the way of its food source. And the problem is its food source is gems. So instantly you can imagine that the dwarves are all having issues with the Zorn because they are mining the gems and the Zorn wants to eat the gems. And so this becomes a bit of a problem that your players might have to deal with. Now, Zorn are really interesting creatures. Because they are earth elemental, they can literally swim through the earth as if though it were water. And so they are very hard to track, very hard to keep tabs on. They're really hard to deal with in battle because they can just move down into the earth and then appear from out of nowhere behind one of your players and attack them. Now, I think they're really interesting creatures because they have a lot of defense. They're very hard to find. They're really grotesque looking. They have like, I want to say 4 arms, but it's also like 4 legs because I assume they just walk amongst all of them. And then this one eye and these teeth and this maw that opens up. So they're quite grotesque, I guess you could say. But I really don't want to give it across that they're an evil creature because they're not. They're just a creature that's living and it just happens to be eating gems. But the plus side is that should you find one, that must mean there are gems hidden somewhere where you're actually currently exploring that might be worth harvesting because these creatures are there eating it. It's like this is their hunting ground almost, and they're hunting for gems to feed themselves. So if your players run into an area where they find it, let them know that they actually might be surrounded by quite valuable gems. And on top of that, if they're carrying any valuable gems, I like to add this little thing in for most creatures when it comes to gold or silver or magical items, and now in this case gems, that the creature that eats it can smell it, it can feel it, it can sense it getting closer to it, and so that draws it to the players. Have a little bit of fun with these creatures, DMs. I think they don't really get used very much, but they're really, really interesting. They're very cool, and I think they're really good for your low-level campaign if you just want to give your players something different rather than just constantly hack and slash hitting at the big thing. Actually have them have to work tactics out. When do we hold our action so that way when the creature appears we can make an attack? Where do we think it's going to appear? Do we want to spread out so that way we do less damage? Do we want to get close together so we all get those opportunity attacks? It can really test your players in just a slightly different way, but still keep that format of we hit as hard as we can. So try them out. DMs, the next creature is probably the most dangerous of the list. This creature, your players will almost always have disadvantage when making attacks against it. They'll realize that their weapons aren't really fully landing and putting as much damage into it as they usually would. So in other words, it needs to be attacked by magical damage, not by adamantium weapons. It must be magical for this creature to take the full brunt of the attack. They cannot be exhausted. They cannot be knocked prone. They cannot be grappled. These creatures are air elementals and they are known as the invisible stalkers. They can hunt your players for days on end because they can travel through the night, through the day, and feel no effects to that matter. They don't need food or air or water to survive. They serve great lords and great wizards, great powerful deities that may need or want your players. They're definitely not for your lower level campaign. I really love the idea of using these creatures as a way to scare your players should they feel like they have the upper hand on the enemy. Perhaps this creature is sitting and lying in wait for the battle to get to a point where it needs to fight. And then your players realize that something in the air is literally trying to suffocate them and get inside of them. Or if your players have a prisoner who they are trying to hold for the night or protect for the night, whether it be a commoner or an actual murderer or whatever you're deciding in your story. But having your players run down to their room, their safe room, their prison, whatever you want to call it, and seeing their quarry actually just sit there and be killed from within. They're not entirely sure what is happening. These creatures are really, really cool. They're very frightening, absolutely like just crazy monsters that you have to put in your next campaign. If you don't use an invisible stalker, I just really feel like these creatures aren't getting the full potential. So that is the list for our monsters for this week. So I would like you to, if you want to keep up with any of the videos, click on these videos here and check them out. As always, like the video, subscribe, comment down below your favorite elemental. And finally, next week, we are going to be looking at monstrosities. I'll see you then.